beforehand when we had our brainstorming session. It was really, really exciting for them to see that the reasons they had come up for British Euroscepticism were reiterated by my colleagues, by people who actually live in Britain or used to live in Britain. And it was also exciting for them to see these people have a discussion between themselves, because at some point they not only replied to my questions, but they started discussing this with each other. And that was a brilliant lesson. In another lesson, in this CLIL course, I used Twitter in a slightly different way. I wanted to do a lesson on the Euro crisis in Greece with my students, and to get them started, I first gave them a text on the pros and cons of bailing Greece out, and then asked them to do some background research on the factors that might have led to the current situation in Greece. Afterwards, I asked my students to draw up a list of questions that they would like to ask Greek citizens about their current situation. So after my students had completed their assignments, I contacted this wonderful person over there, Marisa Konstantinidis in Athens, and Sarah Hannum in Thessaloniki, who are both people in my PLN. I asked them whether they were willing to take part in a lesson of mine. And luckily, they were both available at the time that I was teaching my lesson. So, at the beginning of my next lesson, I projected my Twitter account onto the wall and made sure that Marisa and Sarah were online. My students then started asking them questions, which I posted to my timeline. So here you see a couple of examples of questions that they asked them. They said, for example, how are people in Athens reacting to the threat of pay cuts in the public sector? Are they outraged? Or do you think the EU should provide financial aid to Greece to save the Greek state from bankruptcy? Or is the Greek population totally disenchanted with the EU project? Do they still believe in the EU and their membership? As you can tell from these screenshots from my TweetDeck account, not only Marisa answered our questions, but other Twitter users in my PLN or outside my PLN also got involved in the discussion. I have to admit that this resulted in relative chaos in my classroom, but quite a pleasant form of chaos, because you have to picture me sitting at my desk, typing the questions into the computer for my students and moderating the classroom discussion at the same time, because we wanted to comment on the statements that we got from our Greek friends. Every time, so Marisa and Sarah were our initial focus, but when many other Twitterers got involved, I asked students to read out their tweets for us. So I got one student to focus on Olaf's contributions, one student to read out Marisa's tweets, another student to focus on Sarah's contributions, and so on. For my students, this lesson felt like having a panel discussion at a conference with people from Greece, Romania, Vietnam. Laura Ponting is currently in Vietnam, Britain and Germany, and so on. And it was really exciting for them to hear from people who are affected by the Euro crisis, to hear from them firsthand how they felt about the current situation. I personally thought that this was the perfect way of bringing the outside world into your classroom. After I'd used Twitter with all of my classes during the last winter semester, I wanted them to give me feedback on their microblogging experience. So I carried out a survey in which I asked them a lot of detailed questions. I wanted to find out how many of them had actually joined Twitter, their reasons for not joining or joining, what they had learned, what they thought about my presence on Twitter, whether it was important to them or not, and so on. So I asked them lots of different questions, and the results were not really surprising, because those students who never really posted anything themselves, and every once in a while read other people's tweets, said they found it a bit confusing and slightly boring. They couldn't really engage with Twitter. But the students who got actively engaged and not only read other people's tweets but posted tweets themselves, said that they had learned quite a few useful things by, for example, checking out the links that I and other people had posted. They said that they had been able to practice their English, that they learned new vocabulary, and that all in all they found Twitter quite amazing and amusing. So if they engaged, they really got something out of it. A lot of them said that my presence on Twitter was not really important to them, but they admitted that reading my tweets and connecting with me via Twitter had made their relationship with me a bit more personal, the conversations between us a bit more informal. And I must say, for me that was much the same. I developed a closer relationship to my students. So, looking back on the past 9 months and taking into account the results of my survey, I can safely say that the advantages of using Twitter far outweigh the disadvantages. In my view, I think it can add a lot to your teaching inside and beyond the classroom. So let me tell you about the benefits. First of all, using Twitter greatly improved the cohesion of the groups that I taught. I especially noticed that when they had to interact in class, when they had to do group work together, they connected a lot better than before. For teachers, I think one of the biggest benefits of Twitter is that you learn so much more about your students, yeah? By reading their tweets, but already, for example, by looking at the alias they choose, the avatar they pick, or the information they give about themselves in their bio. And this might help you to meet their special interests and needs much better. To my mind, Twitter makes an ideal language learning environment because students are exposed to authentic communication by and with native speakers in a very informal context. Unlike classroom discussion, classroom communication, which tends to be more task-oriented and more guided, communicating on Twitter is more spontaneous, more immediate, a bit more natural. It's more like having a normal face-to-face conversation with another person. And as a result, people tend to worry less about grammar and spelling mistakes, which was quite liberating for my students once they realized that. Unlike what most uninformed people think, Twitter is not about unidirectional communication. A lot of people think you post an update that nobody ever wants to read, that nobody will ever reply to, but this is not true. I think on the contrary, on Twitter it is very easy to engage in two-way interaction, which can build into become multi-way discourse, as you saw from the examples of lessons that I taught. And I must say, this is where I see the real value of Twitter, because when I started using it, I thought to myself, I use a teaching and learning platform to manage my classes, and I thought, well, couldn't my students just as well use the shared domain and the discussion forum on that platform? But this is where I see the added value of Twitter. If you don't have those discussions in a protected space, other people can join in the discussions and give you their views on the issues that are being discussed. What I also find beneficial about Twitter is that students learn so much more about the different registers of the English language. Jeremy Harmer, for example, is often credited with writing tweets that read like poetry. A lot of people